The Mad Widow, the sky above the alien planet Velther, was deep blue like the ocean before a storm, and the wind moved slowly through the silver trees as if the forest was whispering secrets to itself, and standing alone in the tall grass was a human traveler named Eric, who had come from Earth for a peace mission, but now found himself surrounded by fear and silence. People in the alien city had warned him again and again, with strange looks and quiet voices saying, "Stay away from her, don't go near the widow Jera, she is mad. She talks to shadows and dreams of things that never were. Her mind is broken by sorrow, and her eyes have seen things no one should see." But Eric was not the kind of man who turned away from mystery, and fear always made him curious instead of careful, and something about the way they all spoke of her made him feel that they were hiding something more than just madness, something dark and unspoken. He asked where she lived, and they hesitated before pointing toward the old part of the city where no one went anymore, a place full of empty buildings and broken lights, and he walked there alone, with only the sound of his footsteps on the stone streets and the whisper of the wind behind him. Reached a small house with faded walls and vines growing up the side, and for a long moment he stood still, just looking and listening, because something about this place felt heavy, like a memory that didn't belong to him, like a dream that wanted to be real. Then the door opened slowly with a soft creak, and she was standing there, tall and thin, with long black hair falling over her shoulders and eyes that looked both young and ancient at the same time, and Eric felt like those eyes could see through his skin and into his thoughts. "You are not like the others," she said in a voice that was soft but strong, "and you do not fear me yet, and you should." And she turned and walked back into the house, leaving the door open for him to follow. And he did, because there was no fear in him, only questions and a strange pull like gravity drawing him closer inside. The room was dim and full of strange objects, crystals that hummed quietly, books with symbols he could not read, a fire that burned cold and blue, and in the center of the room was a chair shaped like a crescent moon. And she sat there looking at him with those eyes that never blinked. "They say I am mad," she said, "and perhaps I am. But madness is only truth seen through the wrong eyes, and they did not like what my eyes saw, and so they called it madness instead of danger." Eric asked what she had seen, and she smiled in a way that made his heart beat faster, not with fear, but with the sense that something important was about to begin. "My husband was a scientist," she said, "one of the best we had, and he found something he should not have, a sound that came from beyond the stars, a signal that did not belong to any species known to us, not even the oldest ones, and when he told the council, they told him to forget it. But he could not, and now he is gone." Eric asked, but she looked away and did not answer right away. Instead, she walked to a small box hidden under a floorboard and took out a tiny device shaped like a star and glowing faintly with a red light. "This is the last thing he left behind," she whispered, "and I have never played it before, not fully, because I was afraid of what I might hear and afraid of what might hear me. But you are here now, and maybe you are the reason I waited." She pressed the center of the device, and it began to hum, and then a voice came from it, deep and slow and full of warning, saying, "They are watching. They are waiting. The gate must not open again." And then the device went silent. Eric stared at it, and then at her, and his mind was full of questions, but no words came, because in that moment he felt something shift around him, like the room itself had leaned closer to listen, and his skin was cold, even though the fire still burned. She looked at him, and her voice was lower now, like a secret floating in the air, and she said, "There are things under this planet, things older than light, things the council would rather die than reveal, and my husband found the key, and now they say he is dead, but I know better, and now you know too." Outside, the wind rose higher, and the trees whispered louder, and somewhere in the sky something moved that should not have moved, and Eric knew he had stepped into a story that would not let him go, and the widow who was called Mad might be the only one telling the truth, the forbidden story. Eric could not sleep that night as the stars above Velther blinked like the eyes of something ancient and unseen, and the wind outside The window carried whispers that sounded like broken voices lost in time, and he kept thinking about the strange voice from the crystal device, and the way Jera had looked at him like she already knew what path he would take and what price he would pay for. I sat by the fire that gave no warmth and watched the shadows dance across the walls, and each shadow looked like it had a story to tell, but none of them would speak, unless he listened without fear and without doubt, and so he waited in silence until Jera returned from the room beyond, holding something wrapped in old cloth that shimmered with threads of silver light. "This is what remains of his work," she said in a voice softer than breath, and yet heavy like the sea, and when you see it, you must decide for yourself if madness lives in me or if the madness lies in those who call truth a lie and fear a weapon. She placed the cloth on the table and unwrapped it slowly, and inside was a journal bound in metal and glowing faintly as if it remembered the hand that wrote it and missed the mind that shaped its words. And Eric opened the first page and saw symbols that looked half drawn, half alive, as if they wanted to move when no one watched. "My husband was named Thalon," she said, "and he was not just a scientist, he was a seeker of answers, even when the questions were dangerous, and even when the answers led to shadows. And he believed that the stars held more than just light. He believed they held memory and warning, and that something from the deep dark had spoken first to the ancient ones who vanished long before any of us could rise." Eric turned the pages one by one and saw sketches of machines that looked like skeletons of gods and maps that pointed not to places but to times when the sky cracked open and something passed through unseen and always followed by silence and fire. And he read a line written in bold marks: "The signal is not random, it is a message, and the message is a test Hullen built. A small lab near the ridge where the sky touches the mountain," she said, and he would go there every night and listen to the stars and record what he heard. And one night he came home and said he had found the gate, not just the location, but the key to it, and that something was moving on the other side, something that could think and wait and remember. She showed Eric a small device hidden in the back of the journal, and it pulsed when he touched it, and a low hum began to rise like a song, forgotten by the world, but remembered by the earth, and from it came an image of Thalon standing before a strange door made of black stone with light crawling over its surface like it was alive. "He looks afraid," Eric said without meaning to, and she nodded slowly and replied, "He said the gate spoke to him, not in words but in feelings like cold and hunger and rage, and he believed it was part of a larger design, something built to keep what is inside from getting out, and the council said he was sick, that he had gone too far, but they never once looked at his data. They just took him, and I never saw him again." Eric felt a chill, not from cold, but from the growing shape of the truth that now surrounded him like a fog, and he asked her, "Why? Tell me all this. Why not hide it forever and live quietly with what you know?" And she looked at him with eyes full of fire and pain and said, "Because you are human, and they will not silence you the way they silenced him, and because the Watchers know your kind, they have waited for you." She reached behind the fire and pulled out a hidden panel, revealing a larger device covered in dust and time, and said, "Thalon made this for you, though he did not know your name. He said one would come from the stars and listen and understand, and he told me to wait for the one who did not turn away from fear." Eric placed his hand on the device, and it came alive with symbols and maps, and then a voice spoke again, the same voice from before, but now it said more, and the message was clear: "They are coming. They seek the gate. They seek control. The test begins again, as it always does, and now you must choose to open or to seal." The fire flickered higher, and the shadow stretched longer, and Jera placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "Once the gate is open, it cannot be forgotten, and once the truth is known, it cannot be silenced, and you were never just a traveler. You were always part of the story." Eric stood in the firelight with the journal in one hand and the key in the other, and in his heart grew something heavier than fear and brighter than courage, and the stars above blinked again, but now it felt like they were watching not from far, but from just beyond the veil of sky, and the wind outside spoke again, but this time it carried a name, his name. Voices in the dark. The night sky over Velther was thick with clouds, and the stars were hidden like secrets buried deep, and Eric stood alone on the stone path behind Jera's old home, holding the journal close to his chest as if the answers inside could warm his trembling hands, and in his ears the strange voice from the device still echoed like a ghost refusing to rest. He had not told anyone about what he saw or what he heard, because he knew something had changed in him, something inside had been touched by the voice that spoke not just in words, but in warning, and even now, with no wind and no movement, he could feel the presence of something nearby, like a shadow that did not belong to the night. He returned inside where Jera waited, with her back to the fire and her eyes staring into the dark, as if she could see things others could not, and maybe she could, and maybe she always had. And she turned to him slowly and asked, "Did it speak to you again?" And he nodded, because the voice had whispered again, but this time it had said his name, Eric. It had said not in fear, not in anger, but with a strange kind of knowing. And when he heard it, he had felt a cold breath on his neck, though there was no one there. And now the silence in the room felt too perfect, too still, and Jera spoke again, saying, "It knows who you are now, and that means the Watchers have awakened." Asked her, "Who are the Watchers?" And she walked to a wall covered in maps and diagrams and pulled one down, revealing a symbol etched into the stone behind it, a circle with 7 lines crossing through it. And she touched the center and said, "The Watchers are not alive as we understand life, and they were made long before us by a race so old, even our myths call them ghosts. And the Watchers are not evil and not good. They are just Watchers, and they wait, and they judge." Eric felt a pressure behind his eyes, like a memory trying to break through, and he sat down before the device again and asked her what was the test the voice spoke about. And Jera took a breath and answered, "The test is the same for every race that reaches the stars, and it is always the same question: will you choose control or truth? And most fail because they want to rule, not to understand." That night Eric tried to sleep, but his dreams were filled with broken images. The black gate pulsing like a heart, the voice whispering words he could not fully remember, and Jera standing on the edge of a cliff screaming without sound. As the sky above her cracked open, and something vast and dark fell from it, like a sea turned upside down, he woke up gasping for breath and found that his hand was burning, and he pulled up his sleeve to find a strange mark glowing faintly on his skin, a pattern of circles and lines that looked like the one carved behind the map. And when Jera saw it, her face went pale and she whispered, "They have marked you. That means you are part of the cycle now, and they are watching you directly." Eric did not know if he should be afraid or honored, and he asked, "What does the mark mean?" And she said, "It means you are not just a witness now, you are a player, and the gate will respond to you if you go near it, and that means your choice will matter more than you know." They decided to return to the ridge where Thalen had built his lab and where the signal had first been heard. And the path there was long and silent, and every tree they passed seemed to lean just slightly, as if listening to their steps, and the air grew colder with each mile, until even the wind seemed afraid to move. The lab was hidden behind layers of rock and roots, and they had to crawl through a narrow tunnel to reach the chamber inside. And when they did, Eric felt the hum, immediately low and steady like the breathing of the earth itself, and the machines around the room lit up as they entered, though no power lines ran to this place. Sarah walked to a control panel and placed her hand on it, and the screen blinked and showed a waveform pulsing slowly, and she said, "This is the signal Thalen found, and it has never stopped playing, and no one else has been able to hear it since he vanished until now, until you, Eric, stepped forward, and the signal changed. It shifted into a new shape, and the screen filled with symbols, and then the voice returned louder than before and clearer, and it said, "You have been chosen to witness. You have been chosen to decide. Do you seek power or truth? Do you fear silence or light? Do you follow the council or the stars?" And then the machines shut off and the room went black, and for one long moment, neither Eric nor Jera moved. And then from the darkness came a whisper that did not come from the device and did not come from either of them, and it said, "He did not fall, he was taken, and the gate is not closed, the black gate." The morning came without light, and the sky above Velther was gray like old smoke, covering everything with silence, and Eric walked beside Jera through the narrow mountain path with the journal in his bag and the strange mark still glowing faintly on his arm, as if it was alive and watching. They had left the lab behind with more questions than answers, and the voice that had spoken to them still echoed in Eric's ears as if the mountain itself had whispered it and it again, saying, "He did not fall, he was taken, and the gate is not closed." And those words followed him like a shadow that did not care about sunlight. Hera had said little since they began their journey toward the northern ridge where the Black Gate was hidden, and the air grew colder with each step, and the trees grew thinner until there was only stone and wind and the sound of their boots on the gravel path. And Eric could feel something waiting ahead, something that had waited for a long time. They reached a broken archway carved into the side of the mountain with ancient symbols glowing faintly along its edges, and Jera stopped there and placed her hand on the stone and whispered words in her native tongue that Eric did not understand, and then the ground beneath them trembled slightly like something deep below had heard her voice. "This is the gate," she said, "not the full gate, but the first door that leads to it, and it only opens for those who are marked. And you have been marked not just by chance, but by choice, and the Watchers must have seen something in you that even you do not yet know." Eric stepped forward and placed his hand on the center of the arch, and for a moment nothing happened, and then light spread from his fingers like veins of fire, crawling through the stone, and the arch began to shift and pull back, revealing a dark tunnel leading into the mountain that breathed cold air into their faces like an exhale from the deep. They walked in silence through the tunnel with the walls pulsing softly like they remembered being alive, and the path twisted downward as if leading not just into earth but into memory. And Eric began to see strange shapes in the stone faces, half-formed eyes that blinked, and lines that looked like writing too old to read and too real to ignore. Tunnel ended in a vast chamber with a black floor that reflected nothing, and in the center stood the Black Gate, tall and still and covered in moving light that flowed across its surface like liquid thought. And Eric felt a pressure in his chest, like the gate was looking at him and asking him why he had come. As Hera approached slowly and said, "This is what Thalon found, this is what he tried to understand, and this is what they wanted to forget, because it does not belong to our world or yours, it belongs to the time before memory and the space between stars, and it was never meant to be found again." Eric walked closer, and the mark on his arm burned brighter, and the gate responded with a low hum that filled the air like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant, and symbols began to rise from the floor around him, forming a circle that spun slowly beneath his feet, and he could feel the Watchers watching not from the shadows, but from within the gate itself. Asked Jera what happened to Thalon, and she looked at the gate with eyes full of pain and said he tried to speak to them, to ask questions that no one should ask, and when he touched the gate, it opened just a little, and he stepped inside. "Before I could stop him, and it closed behind him, and has not opened again until now." Eric reached out with one hand, and the gate pulsed once, then twice, then opened slightly with a soft sound like breaking ice, and inside he saw not darkness but swirling light and moving shapes that looked like thoughts and dreams and memories all mixed together like a storm of lost truth and forgotten futures. He did not step through, but he heard the voice again, not from the device this time, but from within his own mind, and it said, "You are closer now. The gate remembers your kind. It remembers the first voices and the last questions, and now you must ask your own or leave in silence forever." Eric stepped back and looked at Jera and said, "I do not know what to ask," and she replied, "The truth always begins with a simple question, and then the answers find you whether you want them or not, and the gate is open, and now the story must move forward with or without you." Stared at the gate with its living light and moving shapes, and felt the weight of the moment pressing against his skin like a second gravity, and he thought about the signal and the journal and Thalon and the choice that now stood before him like a path made of stars and shadows. Then something moved inside the gate. Not clearly, not fully, but enough to make the air shift and the floor hum, and The light changed color and Eric saw a figure just for a second, tall and thin with eyes like mirrors and arms that reached not to harm, but to invite, and then it vanished like breath in wind. He turned to Jera and said, "I saw someone," and she nodded with tears in her eyes and said, "Then you are ready, and the next question must come from your heart, not from fear, and the gate will only answer if the question is true." Eric stood still as the gate whispered in a voice only he could hear, and the mountain around them held its breath. The watchers, the air inside the chamber changed as if the breath of the mountain had been taken away, and Eric stood frozen before the black gate with his heart pounding like a drum too loud for silence, and his thoughts spinning like leaves in a storm with the memory of the figure inside still clear in his mind, and the voice of the gate still echoing inside his head like a song that could not be forgotten. Jera stood behind him with her hands clasped tightly and her eyes fixed on the surface of the gate, which still shimmered like black water reflecting stars that no longer existed, and she spoke softly as if afraid to wake something that was still sleeping, and said, "What you saw was one of them, not as they truly are, but as they wish to be seen. And if they show themselves, then they have accepted your presence, and maybe they are ready to speak." Eric looked back at her with questions in his eyes, but she only nodded and walked slowly to the edge of the circle that now glowed faintly on the ground around the gate, and she opened her hand to reveal a crystal disc, smaller than a coin, and placed it on the floor and stepped back, and the ground beneath the crystal began to rise as if pulled by invisible hands, revealing a platform with strange writing that changed shape every few seconds, like it was alive and uncertain. "This is the voice chamber," she said, "the only place where the watchers can speak without breaking us and without losing themselves. And it was made not by us, not by Thalen, not even by the ones before us, but by the gate itself. And if they wish to be known, then they will use this place to make their message clear, and maybe to ask their own questions in return." Eric stepped onto the platform, and the room grew darker, not with shadows but with the absence of something deeper than light. And then the crystal began to glow and rise slowly, spinning in the air as a new voice filled the chamber, soft and cold and vast like a wind passing through time. And it said, "You are the first of your kind to reach this place, and to ask without pride, and to listen without demand. And for that we answer." Eric tried to speak, but the voice continued not with sound, but with thought, and it filled his mind with images of ancient worlds burning under twin suns of cities, made of crystal and sound, and beings not of flesh but of light and pattern, and the memory of the first war that broke the stars, and the building of the watchers by hands that no longer exist in the shape that once defined them. "Ask who we are," the voice said, "and we are the memory of what came before we are the test and the question. We are not gods and not demons. We are the watchers, and we have watched your kind grow from silence to sound, from earth to sky, and we have waited for the moment when you would find us not with weapons, but with wonder. And that moment is now." Jera stepped forward and asked what happened to Thalen and why he was taken, and the voice responded, "He touched the gate, not in fear but in hunger, and he wished to know what was not yet his to know, and for that he was moved beyond time into the place between moments where all questions wait for answers, and all minds wait for truth, and he is not dead. He is changed, and he listens still." Eric asked what the test was, and why it must be taken, and the voice showed him visions of other worlds that had come before, of species that rose and fell, of leaders who chose silence over truth and control over peace. And each time the watchers had given a choice, and each time the choice had shaped what came after, for better or for worse. "You are marked because your heart remains undecided," the voice said, "and that is the most dangerous and the most hopeful thing of all. And now the gate is open, not just for you, but for what follows you, and your voice will guide what path is taken next, whether toward shadow or light, and the watchers will not choose for you, but we will remember." Crystal dimmed and the platform lowered, and the room began to return to itself, and Eric felt a strange weight inside his chest, not like sorrow and not like fear, but like the beginning of something larger than himself, something that would not be undone once it began. And he turned to Gera and said, I think I understand now, but I do not know what I am supposed to do with this. She walked to him and placed the journal in his hand and said, you carry the memory of the man I loved and the voice of the ones who waited, and you do not need to know everything, you only need to keep walking, and to keep asking, and to keep listening. Even when no one else will. They left the chamber with the voice still echoing faintly like a fading dream, and the stars above Velther burned brighter than before, as if watching and waiting, and somewhere beyond the mountains, beyond the silence and the sky, something old had turned its gaze toward. Earth, the councils lie, the skies above. Velther turned silver as the twin moons crossed paths, and Eric stood near the base of the ridge with the weight of the watchers in his chest, and the memory of the gate burned into his mind like fire that could not cool, and the mark on his arm now pulsed with a rhythm, not his own, a signal, not of this world, but carried by his blood like an ancient echo waiting to speak. Sarah stood beside him, watching the horizon with quiet eyes, knowing what must come next and what it might cost, and in her hand she held the crystal voice device, still humming, faintly, still remembering, and she said the council must hear it now, they must see what they tried to hide and deny in silence, and if they refuse again, then the truth must go beyond them and reach those who still believe in light. Eric did not speak because words felt small now, and the voice of the watchers still whispered inside his thoughts, not with sentences, but with meaning, and he understood that silence was no longer safe, and lies were no longer walls, they were doors waiting to fall, and the truth could no longer wait behind mountains and stone and fear. They returned to the city, walking through streets filled with quiet watchers, alien citizens who looked away when Gera passed, and whispered when they saw the human who walked beside her with eyes like stormlight and steps that knew where they were going and why. They could not stop at the great hall of the council. Guards moved to block their way, but Eric raised his hand and the mark glowed with such force that the air around him shifted, and the guards stepped back without a word, without a fight, without even understanding why. They obeyed something they had never seen before. The hall was full, and the council sat high above, cloaked in light and tradition and fear, dressed as power, and when they saw Gera they frowned, and when they saw Eric they leaned forward with questions on their faces but no welcome in their hearts. You return with shadows, said the high speaker, his voice smooth like cold metal and his eyes sharp like broken glass, and you bring the widow who speaks to ghosts and the human who walks where he should not, and yet you stand here like you are owed answers. Eric stepped forward and placed the crystal voice device in the center of the floor, and said, I bring not shadows but truth, and not fear but warning, and the gate has opened, and the watchers have spoken, and what you call madness is the only voice that told the truth when all others stayed silent. The device lit up and the voice began to speak, not in full power, but enough to shake the chamber, enough to carry the message they had both heard and now shared. And the watchers spoke of the test, and the gate, and the races that failed, and those that disappeared, and the voice ended with one sentence that made every wall feel closer, every breath feel heavier. You are not alone, and you have never been. Silence followed the message, not deep silence, but forced silence, like a pause before thunder. And then the high speaker rose slowly and said, lies made from fear and tricks from old machines and dead science, and nothing more. And he looked at Gera and said, your husband died chasing voices, and now you drag this outsider into your sorrow and shame, and you will not bring war to our people with stories and sound. Eric stepped forward again and said, you know he was taken, and you know the gate is real, and yet you choose silence because the truth would break. The walls you built from pride and the power you hold would vanish if the people saw what was hidden. And he raised his hand again, and the mark blazed like a star, and for the first time the council looked to Fra Gera, turned to the people in the hall, not the council, but those who had come to listen, and said, my husband found a signal, and for that they erased him, and I carried his truth alone until now, and now you have heard it and seen it, and you must ask why they feared it more than war. A murmur rose in the chamber like wind before a storm, and one voice spoke from the crowd. a young alien with clear eyes and a strong voice, who said, "Why would they silence truth if it was not dangerous to lies?" And another voice said, "We have the right to know," and more voices followed like a wave that could not be stopped. The council stood frozen, watching their control slip away like sand through fingers that had never learned to hold anything but silence. And Eric turned to Jera and said, "It has begun," and she nodded with eyes full of tears, not from sorrow but from the end of fear and the birth of something new that night. Escaped the city with help from those who still believed in stars and questions and hope, and they carried the voice, device, the journal, and the truth that could no longer be caged, and above them the sky burned with light, not from war, but from eyes that had waited long enough to see somewhere in the dark between worlds. Something ancient stirred and turned its gaze toward the rising sound of truth, and the gate remembered. The truth must survive. The sky above Velthor turned red with the light of distant storms, and the ground below trembled with a hum that was not thunder and not wind, but something older and deeper, like the breath of the planet itself shifting beneath the weight of the truth that could no longer be hidden. And Eric stood on the edge of the valley with the voice device in his hand and the mark on his skin glowing brighter than fire. Beside him stood Jera, her face calm and fierce, and behind them stood those who had heard the message in the council hall and believed, not because they were told to, but because their hearts had stirred. When the Watchers spoke and the lie began to crack, not with shouts, but with silence breaking like ice under new light, the council had closed its doors and sent warnings across the stars, declaring the message false and the voices dangerous and the gate forbidden once again. But it was too late, because the truth had taken root in the minds of the people. And truth, once awakened, does not sleep again. From Earth a human vessel approached, a silent diplomatic ship with no weapons, but with eyes wide open and signals asking questions and sending greetings. And Eric had called them when the gate opened. And now they were here above Velthor, hovering in the sky like a new question waiting to be answered. Sent them one message with the voice of the Watchers and the images of the gate and the words of Thalon still alive in the journal. And he said, "We must listen before we speak, and we must see before we judge, and above all, we must remember before we forget." Humans on the ship listened, and the captain, a woman named Lyra, responded with only 5 words, "We are ready to hear more." And Eric knew then that the Watchers had chosen well, and the time for silence had ended forever. Jera stood before the people gathered in the valley and held up the journal and said this was written by a man they tried to erase, and the voice inside it does not belong to one race or one world. It belongs to all who ask questions and all who seek without fear, and it must not be lost again. She placed the journal into a device that began to copy it line by line into light and sound, sending it through the sky to the human ship and to every satellite that still listened and every station that still dreamed. And she said, "If I fall, let this survive. And if they silence us, let this speak louder." Eric turned toward the ridge where the gate had opened, and the Watchers had spoken, and he walked slowly toward it with others following behind. And when he reached the edge, he saw the light again pulsing from the stone like a heart ready to open, and the ground around it glowed with the mark now shared by many, not just him. He touched the gate, and the voice returned softer now and slower, as if speaking to a child, or maybe to a future still unsure of its name. And it said, "You have brought the question to those who still listen. And now the story must pass from our memory to yours, and what you do with it will shape the stars that follow." Then the gate opened, not in fear and not in threat, but in peace, and inside stood Thalon, no longer lost, no longer fading. His form changed, but his eyes still clear. And he looked at Jera and reached out with hands that had crossed time and sorrow, and she ran to him and held him without words, without need for anything but the moment. Eric watched as the Watcher stepped into view, not fully formed, not flesh, not light, but something in between. And they stood without weapons and without shields, and one stepped forward and said, "We do not lead, we do not rule, we witness, and now we will witness together." Valley filled with the light of truth, and the air shimmered with memory, and from above the human ship began to broadcast. The message to every connected world, and on Earth children stopped to listen, and leaders stopped to fear, and a voice, once buried in a cave on a far world, became the voice of hope. Later, the council would fall not in fire, but in silence as their power faded beneath the weight of their own fear, and a new path would open, shaped by those who asked and listened and carried the truth forward like a flame past. Hand to hand, never burning, but always warm, Eric stood at the gate one last time, with the wind in his face and the stars clear above him, and he smiled not because the journey was over, but because it had just begun, and he whispered to the wind, "Thank you for trusting me," and the wind whispered back in a voice that was not his own, but somehow always had been. "Truth must survive," the voice said, "and now it will, not just in words, and not just in stone, but in hearts that remember, and in stars that watch, and in stories that never end."